So welcome everyone to the Center for Governance and Markets to our virtual seminar series on the economics of race and identity. We're really thrilled to have with us Desiree Desierto this week. And she is going to present her work, The Political Economy of Status Competition, Sumptuary Laws in Pre-Industrial Europe. It's a paper that she's written with Mark Koyama. And a little bit about Desiree. She's a faculty affiliate at George Mason University. She was a postdoctoral associate at the W. Allen Wallace Institute of Political Economy at the University of Rochester. And she has her PhD from the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a PhD in economics from the University of Nottingham. So we're really delighted to have you with us today, Desiree. We're really looking forward to this talk. So the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm just going to view this, like maximize this thing so it's better. Right. So can you see the full screen? Right. Okay, so good afternoon, and thank you everyone here present who've made the time to attend this talk. And I especially want to thank the Center for Governance and Markets for organizing and letting me participate in this very important, most timely seminar series on the economics of race and identity. So this is joint work with Mark Koyama at George Mason University. So this paper essentially is about elites enacting laws that restrict the consumption of non-elites of what we call status-producing goods. And they do this in order to preserve their relatively higher status. In other words, they enact these laws to preserve the status hierarchy. So in a particular context, we look at sumptuary laws in pre-industrial Europe. These are laws that prescribe the type of clothing that one could wear based on one's social status. For instance, like no one can wear gold, silk, or cloth except, say, members of the nobility. So during pre-modern times, wearing elaborate clothing was a primary way of expressing, or as it were, consuming one's status. Clothing actually took up the largest share of the household income after basic subsistence needs are met. Of course, nowadays that's no longer the case, but one can think of analogous status-producing goods in developed economies, like, for instance, housing or even education. So what we do is look at a particular historical episode in which clothes were the major status-producing goods. And then we generate findings and insights that we think can be applicable to other contexts, other status-producing goods, for instance, or even other periods, including present times. So by doing so, we try to uncover the mechanisms by which status inequality is perpetuated or ameliorated. So our approach here in this paper is one of analytic narrative. We combine rich historical evidence with a newly collected country level and city level data set of sumptuary laws in Europe between 12th and the 18th centuries. And then from these, we are able to gather some stylized facts that help us inform, help us formulate a model that we believe is the most plausible explanation for this phenomenon. And then this model generates theoretical predictions, which we then take to the data and test. So beginning in the late Middle Ages, European states passed laws that regulated what people could wear. And these laws are actually a very important part of the political economy of late medieval and early modern states. In fact, monarchs like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I were personally involved in drafting these sumptuary legislation. So these laws were actually a part of the whole legal and economic order of pre-industrial states. It's an important example of what Johnson and Koyama in their book call identity rules. So the question is, why did pre-modern states frequently pass and enforce sumptuary legislation? And why did these laws proliferate in the late Middle Ages and early modern period and not earlier or later? And then why did these laws eventually disappear? So in answering these questions, we contribute to several broad literatures. So there's a literature that shows how status concerns affect a lot of outcomes, such as like luxury good spending, risk-taking, human capital accumulation, and inequality. So there's also growing literature on identity that is being analyzed through the lens of political economy. And there's also, of course, a bigger literature on institutions' economic development. And in this respect, we contribute to this analysis since sumptuary laws are a type of institution that contribute to our understanding of the relationship between institutional change and economic development. So to help us, to help us in our analysis, we've compiled country level data on sumptuary laws from many sources. Many of these sources here, we've compiled them. We also have data on just Italian cities that we get from Killerby. So all in all, we're able to code 1,181 distinct sumptuary laws between the period 1150 to 1850. We also, of course, compile a usual set of covariates that are typically used to study pre-modern Europe. So we're going to start with some stylized facts from our reading of the historical literature. First of all, these laws clearly benefited elites at the expense of the lower classes, right? These were about maintaining the existing status hierarchy. For instance, in a 1483 Act in England, it stated that no man below the estate of lord shall wear plain cloth of gold. In France, in 1485, you have a similar restriction. You have gold, silver, and silk cloth were prohibited for all except nobles living nobly who are born and extracted of good and old nobility.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
I'm just unbelievably ignorant on this context. Is any of this aimed at like nobles who are not living nobly? So like those who've fallen out of, who don't have money, or, I mean, is this a problem that they're trying to address?
So it's usually cast as a prohibition, right? So for certain things, only these certain classes can use these. So we don't know of any kind of restriction which qualified what nobility based on, say, their income, how rich.
So if I'm like, what's the term, like genteel poverty, where I'm still like
right. So
I'm still a landlord, but I don't have a lot of money, that's okay?
Yeah, so let's look at say in Tudor England, right? So they could be pretty explicit what types of nobility are allowed to wear certain things. For instance, earls and all superior degrees, and viscounts and barons. We can also have dukes. The exception can include dukes, marquesses, earls, or their children. So it's pretty much specifies like the title, right? What are you in the status hierarchy? But there's also other things that allow like lower levels, right? You have the son and heir or daughter of a knight or wife of said son. So it can be pretty explicit in terms of who exactly, like what title you have to have, like, and then what kind of cloth or anything, even from ruffles, for instance. So it could be literally pretty specific. But of course, there's no way of knowing whether like only nobility to a certain income level, or if you're impoverished or anything, right? So that will depend, of course, affect to what extent you can actually take advantage of these laws. I mean, if you have the right to do all of these, but you're actually impoverished, of course you can't really buy. But the point of this is that the laws are couched in order to benefit the higher status. It's about prohibiting certain clothing material or certain styles to be used by the lower classes. So we have all these. So one of our, again, another stylized fact we have, that these sumptuary laws were enforced. They were really strictly enforced, but they were also violated. So in other words, they had real bite. So punishments were usually in terms of confiscations and fines, but you also had more severe punishments, including being placed in the pillory or stocks. You could also face excommunication and even imprisonment. So to give us an idea, in Germany alone, in one town alone, in Wiltburg, just for 1 year, 713 to 714, there was actually a booklet of clothing fines where 10% of the population of that town were actually fined for forbidden garments. So it was enforced, like the fines were enforced, but also it was violated. So it had real bite. The third, probably most important stylized fact that we gathered from all our data is that sumptuary laws seem to have followed an inverted U-shaped path over time. So for instance, if you see the laws in France, right, they start increasing by 13th century and bumps up there before falling again late in 17th century. And then, for instance, England follows the same pattern, right? You also have like kind of inverted U shape. And then this is the Holy Roman Empire, including Germany. That's Spain for you, and that's Northern Italy.
So I can also just ask about the enforcement. So when you say people violate these restrictions, are those always locals, or are those people who happen to travel through the town, they wear the wrong stuff, and they were absolutely unaware of the rules?
Yeah, I'm sure there might be cases of those, but usually these are locals, like the town, these are people who lived in Vilberg. And there are actually interesting anecdotes. There was also a case of a lawyer, for instance, who appeared in court, who dressed above his station, and he actually lost his job. So it was pretty much like enforced. In England, these cases were such a big deal that even these cases could even go up to the Star Chamber, right? So it's pretty much a lot of enforcement, but there's also violation. So the graphs, like we've shown you, seems to show that they proliferate at intermediate levels of income, of economic development, and then they seem to have disappeared as economies developed. So why is that the case, right? So we want to kind of show, so before we present I think our best reading of the historical literature, we're just gonna look at several alternative hypotheses and try to rule them out. So first of all, there are some historians which claim that maybe it coincides with changes in political power, right? Maybe as merchants acquired political power, they might have used that power to remove sumptuary laws. This, however, is at odds with historical evidence, simply because, say, the rise of the merchant city-states like Florence and Venice did not actually see a weakening of sumptuary laws, but on the contrary, as you see their rise, it also coincides with the proliferation of such laws. So the timing seems to be off for this kind of story. Another hypothesis is probably religion, right? Perhaps the laws were a response to ecclesiastical demands for more austere clothing, right? Again, we see this being at odds with the historical evidence, because the biggest shock to the religious equilibrium in Europe, which was the Reformation, seems to have no discernible impact on sumptuary laws. In fact, they continued to proliferate in both Catholic and Protestant countries well into the 16th and 17th centuries. And then lastly, there's a hypothesis that says it's about costly signaling, right? Sumptuary laws were a way to avoid the costly signaling of one's status, right? Perhaps, people would just see what one person is wearing and automatically know where that person belongs in the social hierarchy. However, if this were the case, then there would be no reason to specify clothing for the monarch and the highest nobility, as everyone already knew who they were, right? We see these kinds of laws. So on the contrary, we see the clothing during this period was not simply a signal of one's status. There are really literally a way of consuming or expressing one's status. So in trying to come up with our own explanation, we want to be able to explain that inverted U-shaped pattern for the sumptuary laws, but we also want to be able to do it as succinctly as possible. So we want to just have the most minimal assumptions. We are just going to be guided by two observations: that sumptuary laws really benefited elites who want to maintain what we call their status distance from non-elites, and that the enforcement and violation of these laws seem to matter quite a lot in our reading of the historical evidence. So The setup of the model is quite simple, and we abstract away from many things, so we will just focus on essentials. So first we have ruling elites, call them B, and then we have E rather, and then we have citizens denoted by B, both of which consume some ordinary goods called X and some status producing good L, which in this case is clothing. So, and then citizens earn some income, big Y, and whereas elites appropriate a fraction tau of it. And so the elite's disposable income is simply tau times Y, while the citizen's disposable income is 1 minus tau times Y. And then there's a minimum subsistence income level called that Y bar. This simply means that below Y bar, individuals only consume ordinary goods. They don't care about status. And then finally, we model that elites care about their status good consumption relative to the citizens. So not just their absolute level of status good consumption, but how is that relative to the citizens, what we call a status distance. So from these very simple model setup, we can construct the utility functions for the elites and the non-elites. So here it just simply says that below the threshold subsistence level Y bar, both elites and citizens do not care about status. Above Y bar, then they start caring about status. This Y bar we call here, this is like, depends, right? It's pretty relative. I mean, at what point do you start caring about, say, clothing as a signifier of status? We don't really model it because we abstract away from, that kind of explanation. When did people start using clothes as a signifier of status? So we have very minimal assumptions here. So for the non-elites, for the citizens, they care about above the threshold, they care about their consumption of this ordinary good and clothing. Whereas for elites, they care about their consumption of good XE and that status distance, right? LE minus LB, how far their status good consumption is from the other class. So we make very little assumptions. If you notice, these utility forms are very general. The only restriction we put is that these preferences are non-homothetic above the threshold. So with those very simple utility functions, we have, again, a very simple game. A game is simply the nature decides whether income is above or below that subsistence level. And then elites choose whether to enact a sumptuary law or not. If they don't enact a law, then each player chooses how to allocate their disposable income over the ordinary good and the status good. But if they choose to enact a sumptuary law, non-citizens can always choose whether to obey it or not, right? If they obey it, then elites only incur some fixed cost of having to maintain the law. But if they disobey, elites incur both a fixed cost and a variable cost for enforcing the law. This variable cost will be increasing by the amount of status good consumption that the citizens go over the permitted level. So on the other hand, the citizens always also can incur fine if they were caught. So in other words, they have an expected cost of evasion, which is just theta times F. So after this, they all the players, citizens and elites choose their bundle. Elites choose, or rather non-citizens choose what they consume, X and L. Elites choose what they consume, X and L, but they also consume the permitted level of status good consumption by non-elites, which we denote by L bar B. So before we present the equilibrium of the game, we were just going to use a bit of notation here to make it easier to discuss the equilibrium later. So we're just going to use cases A, B, C, D, E, F. So whenever we subscript the payoffs with this, what we mean is that A is just a situation where you're below the threshold subsistence level and no sumptuary law is enacted. B is you're above that threshold and no sumptuary law is enacted. C is you're below and sumptuary law is enacted and obeyed, and etc. So this is just to keep track of the notation. So the equilibrium, right? So what we have proposition 1 here. Basically what it tells us, what's the important part here is equation 3, which tells us under what conditions is eta equals 1, or sumptuary law is enacted, or 0, or it's not enacted. So, so what's happening here? The most important part of the equation, it tells us, it really depends on 3 things, on 3 cases, right? Cases F, B, and D, right? So F, B, and D are all cases under which you're above the threshold level of income. But the difference is F is the case in which a sumptuary law is enacted and disobeyed. B is where there's no sumptuary law at all. And D is there's a sumptuary law, but it is obeyed. So essentially, whether or not a sumptuary law is enacted entails comparing what elites would obtain when there's no sumptuary law enacted versus what they would obtain when there is a sumptuary law, but it is disobeyed. And then for non-elites, we would compare what they would obtain when there is a sumptuary law and they disobey it versus what they would obtain if they obeyed the law. So in more precisely, we can denote, say, V, the probability that UEF is bigger, or at least as large as UEB. W is the probability that UBD is at least as large as UBF. And so given this, proposition 1 implies that the probability of enacting a sumptuary law eta equals 1 is going to be equal to V plus 1 minus V times W. So what we do then to see the effect of income, we take the derivative of this equation with respect to income. And it turns out when we do that, we're able to generate a non-monotonic relationship between income Y and probability eta equals 1 under certain conditions. So this is the what we're going to test later, basically. So this simply means that under conditions 1 and A and B, there is a level of income Y star such that below it, the probability that elites enact a sumptuary law increases with income. But above it, above this Y star, the probability that they increase income now, the probability that they increase, that they enact the sumptuary law already decreases with income. So this is like this inverted kind of U-shaped relationship between income and sumptuary laws. So this could plausibly explain the inverted U-shaped patterns we saw earlier, because incomes in Europe were also increasing beyond subsistence levels since the 13th century. So I'm going to show you how we test this later on, but before we do so, I'm just going to get into a little bit of the intuition of what's going on in the model. So what happens when income increases, right? So on the one hand, elites can buy more status goods, and therefore they can potentially maintain their status distance from elites without having to enact a sumptuary law. So this would typically raise UEB, which means that we're going to be here, that part, that curve, this curve here, UBD would be big, so you'd be under there. On the other hand, for the citizens, they can also afford to buy more status goods. The question is, would they buy over the regulated limit, right? If elites can counter it with sufficient enforcement, then disobeying the law would still not be worthwhile for non-elites. And hence, in this case, UBD would be greater than UBF, which takes us to this curve here. So what's going on? Putting it together, as incomes rise, more resources are poured into enforcement, and then citizens are initially deterred from disobeying the law. At some point, however, incomes would be so high to enable citizens to actually disobey the law. The fines are just, they could just pay it. But this further increases enforcement costs. At some point, here, at this point here, elites are now better off using their resources to buy more status goods to try to maintain that status distance rather than waste it on enforcement. And so they cease to enact sumptuary laws, and we see a fall in the probability that elites enact a sumptuary law. One final result that we can get from the model, which again we're going to test in a bit, is the role of rent seeking, right? So recall earlier that we used tau as the extent to which elites can appropriate the income produced by citizens. So in a way, it's a measure of rent seeking, right? The closer tau is, the more rents that can be appropriated by total income. So this proposition simply tells us that under certain conditions, the initial rise of sumptuary laws as a response to increased income is more likely to occur when there is less rent seeking, when tau is low. So you can see that here, when tau is high, so when tau is high, conversely, you see less of that effect. We don't have a big hump when tau is low. So what is the intuition going here? So it's simply that, so when rents are low, it means that there's a more equal distribution of total income between elites and non-elites. So if there's a more equal distribution there, non-elites can more easily approach the elites' level of status good consumption. This then induces the elites to enact more sumptuary laws because the threat from the citizens, the status threat is bigger. So it is more, they are more threatened in terms of non-elites catching up to their status. So what they do, they clamp down on it and impose sumptuary laws. So we're going to test these two things, right? One, we're going to show whether there is indeed a non-monotonic relationship between income and sumptuary laws, and then whether this inverted U relationship is more likely when rent seeking is low. So to start with, right, this is simply, we use our cross-country data first to plot just a simple relationship between GDP per capita and the number of sumptuary laws. So this is just a bin scatter plot using all our data from 17 European regions and countries. So, just visually, the hump seems to be apparent, right? So to increase GDP per capita, it seems like the number of sumptuary laws go up, but eventually it goes down.
So I don't want to sound like a typical economist here, but anyone's going to ask about the two outliers.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. It's probably being driven by this, but I'm sure
I mean, otherwise there's like no relationship, right? I mean, it wouldn't just be like a straight line.
So you could treat these outliers, but that will still be driven by this, and you can argue maybe this is also an outlier. So then, of course, if we treat everything as an outlier, then
So what are those two up there?
So this is a bin scatter plot. So this is not.
Okay. So I'm sorry. Mark is like schooling me in econometrics in the chat, and I'm not seeing it. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Right. So this is simply just like just a picture, just to motivate our analysis. So actually, if you just look at different countries as well, like this is like the Holy Roman Empire. Again, you might say that these are outliers, but again, this is like a bin scatter plot. This is Spain, right? This is England, and this is France. So of course the peaks are different, but visually at least they seem to follow an inverted U-shaped pattern. So so a better test on the model. So we can't really identify it here. First of all, of course, GDP per capita is so endogenous. This are really just correlations. So we want an exogenous variation that could proxy for GDP per capita. So then what we do, we use our data on Italian city-states. So these, we have a unique data set. This is more than 300 sumptuary laws spanning the period 1100 to 1500 for more than 40 cities. So using this data set allows us to use the Black Death and occurrences of bubonic plagues as a proxy for income. So in a Malthusian economy, the fall in population from the plague led to a rise in per capita income and wages of citizens across Europe. So this is the graph showing the relationship between real wages and population in Florence. And you can see there is a clear inverse relationship between populations and real wages, which is what we'd expect in Malthusian economy. So several papers on the Black Death have also shown that plague outbreaks appear to have been random and uncorrelated with observable city characteristics, and nor were they associated with major cultural or institutional change, which suggests that plague shocks are exogenous proxies for upward pressures on per capita income of citizens. The drawback using this data is it only really goes up to 1500. So our major source here is Killerby, and the data on Sumptuary laws only captures up to 1500. So we're not really capturing the subsequent decline in the number of Sumptuary laws which happened after. So in other words, we can only test the first part of the prediction of the model, which is at intermediate levels of income, we should see a positive relationship between income and the number of Sumptuary laws. So we basically, using this data set, we estimate the following equation. We organize it by city, by decade. We do have data as well by year, city year, but for the purpose of this presentation, we just present the city decade regressions. So we have the number of Sumptuary laws of a city in a particular decade. It's going to be predicted by the number of plagues in the previous decade in that city. And then we include city fixed effects, we include decade fixed effects, and the whole usual barrage of controls, including latitude, longitude, whether a city has access to a river or sea, ruggedness, soil quality, whether it has an bishopric, a university, or it's a commune or ruled by a prince. So, so this is our main result here. We run the regression both by OLS and also negative binomial because there's a lot of zeros in some periods. So pretty much, as you can see, it's pretty much robust. I mean, in the most restrictive specification number 3 here, basically what it's saying is a plague in the previous decade leads to an increase of 0.128 Sumptuary laws in the next decade. So we do a bunch of robustness checks to this. Like, for instance, we use Conley standard errors. Maybe, there's a lot of spatial correlation, autocorrelation. But you can see here that it's still pretty much the same. And even if we increase the number of spatial lags, the standard errors don't change much. So in the paper, you'll see we do a lot of things. We just subset the data so many ways, but the effect of the plague just doesn't go away. So when we test proposition 3, so proposition 3 is we want to see, is there a positive relationship between intermediate levels of income and Sumptuary laws for the less rent-seeking cities, right? The prediction tells us we have to see it. It's got to be more apparent if the city is less rent-seeking. So we constructed 3 measures of the extent of rent seeking. One is whether the city is non-despotic or despotic. We got this from Killerby. Despotic cities are ruled by a single individual as opposed to a republic, which means that we expect the rent seeking to be higher in these despotic cities. Indeed, as you notice in columns 1 and 2, the effect of the plague, the positive effect of the plague is actually just holds for the non-despotic cities, which have relatively lower rent seeking, which is what's predicted by the model. We also have alternative data on whether the city is a commune or not a commune. Communes had more representative institutions, and therefore we expect to have less rent seeking here. And again, we see the same, right? Even controlling for so many things, it's the communes that actually have a significant positive relationship, whereas for non-communes, there's no discernible relationship. The drawback to these data is that, well, when we coded it, they just gave us basically a fixed, it's not time varying. They just coded it that the cities once, and we don't know the changes for these codings later on. So we also, as an alternative, we coded our own time varying, at least decade time varying measure of whether the city remained a republic or not. And this is a more probably conservative result. They're both still now significant, but at least, again, as predicted the data, the relationship is stronger for republics in which rent seeking is expected to be lower. So that's for the intermediate levels of income. We don't have data to identify the decline in sumptuary legislation, higher levels of income. Like I said, Killebreach stops like at 1500 basically, so we can't code it. But some historical accounts render support to our model in pointing out that the problem of rising enforcement costs during the 18th and 19th centuries was a big deal, you know. This is when sumptuary legislation declined. So in France, for instance, one historian noted that as the 17th century wore on, sumptuary laws mandated more frequent searches, usually by officers of the local police. At the same time, the evasion of these laws became an increasing problem, and many historians noted that luxury consumption could no longer be restricted to elites. And by the 18th centuries, even servants could save up to 8 shillings for a ready-made gown. So, so at least like qualitatively, we render some support that the problem is really about the rising costs, enforcement, and the increased just evasion of these laws. We do have preliminary, we're still working on this, but we do have some time series data back on our cross-country data set, right? So this is France. This is probably the most complete data we have in our cross-country data. This is France, where we just plotted simple plot with sumptuary laws on GDP per capita. And here we do see, you know, a kind of decline as you increase per capita in the decade. We have initially run, you know, if you run just simple time series regressions on this, and then try to capture the decline by squaring GDP per capita, we actually see the expected results we have, where GDP per capita would be positive and then the square would be negative. But what we're trying to do right now is to pool all our other time series for all the other countries to see to what extent is this robust. Of course, this is still, you know, GDP per capita is highly endogenous, but our initial results do suggest that they follow, like there's a hump. So to conclude, what we've done in this paper is we proposed a theory of status competition between elites and non-elites. In a formal model, we show how concerns about maintaining status hierarchy causes elites to enact laws to restrict the consumption of status-producing goods by the lower classes. This model predicts the proliferation of sumptuary legislation between 12th to 17th century Europe. This is when merchant classes rise and become more of a status threat to the ruling elites. And then the demise of such laws in the 18th to 19th centuries, when you have much higher incomes from the rising classes that enabled them to increasingly evade these laws, making enforcement more and more costly. We're also able to render empirical support to these predictions using our newly collected cross-country institute level data. So we reiterate, this data pertains specifically to pre-industrial Europe, but our model and findings can be generalizable. Actually, in our appendix, we have a huge appendix where we actually look at even sumptuary legislation during the Roman era, or also Ottoman Empire, and also in Japan. So they seem to have coincided with the, you know, rising incomes, and then later on, as incomes continue to rise, they taper off. So that also can potentially explain restrictive laws in present times. Clothes nowadays may no longer be an important status producing good in developed economies, but status concerns still remain. And so our framework can shed light on other policies used to restrict status competition, like zoning laws, for instance, or even laws restrict housing or even education. So that's all I have for now. Any questions will be much welcome.
I like the idea of zoning laws as a framework for restricting status competition.
Yeah, we wanted to restrict at first our idea where we'd want to be conservative and say, look, we're just really, our data is just, pre-industrial Europe, let's stick to it. But when we developed the model, it's literally we were just surprised at how very little assumptions, almost no assumptions at all, very similar game. And there's nothing specific to clothing that we were actually able to get these results. And so we're thinking, we think this is a viable way of thinking about any good that on which status relies, right? So the idea is like other laws that are prohibited, say drugs, right? It's not a status producing good per se. So when ruling elites kind of enact drug enforcement, maybe they're just reacting to, say, the negative externality in the society. They don't exactly want like their drug consumption to be higher than non-elites, right? So they just want to suppress some negative externalities between it. So what's different here is that the elites themselves have a stake in enforcing these laws.
Thanks.
I just have a question for you. Sort of taking the inverse of what a sumptuary law is. A lot of the places where I work in the Muslim world, you find the opposite kind of laws, is that you have officials who try to get people to dress in certain ways and enforce, like, it was really interesting. There was a king of Afghanistan who in the 1920s said that you couldn't come into the capital without a suit and a tie and like a top hat.
Oh, wow.
Right? Like nobody in Afghanistan owned a suit and a tie or so there were these stories of people like renting. There were rental stations when you came into the city and you had to change your clothes. And there are these really like strange pictures of, elders who, you see pictures of Afghans today, like in this traditional, that's still how they dress. But for this brief period of time, everyone was forced to wear a suit and a tie.
Yeah.
And, in Turkey, right, there was like a lot of enforcement of, especially on Islam and countries that wanted to secularize. I don't know what obviously your model says something about a different kind of law. But I just don't know if you have any thoughts about that, because it's kind of like the inverse kind of competition. You're trying to elevate rather than exclude.
So, I mean, it's preliminary, but we've got a section, and Mark can jump in anytime, but we think it's not, the status can be defined, the status hierarchy can be defined in many ways. Like, for instance, we find it could be defined along the lines of, say, religion, like religious hierarchy, right? So you could have like, you could also have in terms of, I don't know, other cleavages like race, for instance. So it can be pretty specific, but the question is, what would make the ruling elites distinguish themselves from? Is it like they're gonna be more kind of austere looking? Like, for instance, now the culture now is like you've got millionaires and billionaires, them dressing down a lot. Right? Sometimes it's the reverse. You see as developed countries as well. If you're like, rich people, like you gotta dress down versus less affluent people, those in the lower class tend to kind of dress up more. So it really, it can be really relative to what.
I might have an example, which might be of interest to Jen. So the reason dress codes in Eastern Europe among Jews tended to emphasize very plain clothing, wearing black. And one explanation for this is that if any Jew was too richly dressed, they basically make the whole target. People would think, wow, the Jews have loads of money. We can tax them more, or we can extract more, we can extort them for money. And so no matter how affluent you were, you're encouraged to dress like a very modest, basically black. That's how these kaftans that people in ultra-Orthodox communities kind of tend to wear. That's how they seem to have been adopted. But that's the opposite of our story here, because in that story, like if you dress too richly, you impose a negative externality on the whole community. So the whole community is an incentive to regulate dress, to make everyone look dressed down. Here it's a little bit different because it's the elite who are restricting what they can wear. But I think the dress codes were important historically, definitely, in many cases, for many different reasons.
So my point is that it's pretty trivial to kind of rescale. I mean, the utilities, right? You kind of redefine it so that what is actually higher utility is the smaller consumption and in reverse, basically. So it can literally be, but you're right, but Mark's right. There are other kind of factors that might be very much more relevant in this case, but I think it's easy enough to make extensions on the basic model of status competition and include other factors, cultural, institutional, that matter.
I think in like this strange Afghan case, it was like very like self-hating, that the leaders really looked down on people and wanted to elevate their status. So how do you do it? You make them behave like Europeans, right? Like we want to impose these norms. And so the quickest way to do it is, you know, through things that are outwardly visible, right? It's harder, much more difficult to change the social norms. And that's why I just think it might just be a little bit of the inverse, but I'm just speculating. Yeah. Any other questions?
Well, should we unmute ourselves and go like this?
Yeah.
Right.